Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leading with Agility, the show that uses the world around us to explore how leadership can be inspired by agility. I'm your host, Arif, and as always, I'm joined by
myself, TK, the coach that sometimes worries too much.
That is true indeed. Welcome back to all our listeners. Today's episode, we are joined by the lovely Toby Sinclair, who is an employee experience consultant. Welcome, Toby, and thank you for joining us.
Nice to meet you, Arif. TK. It's great to be here with you today.
Amazing.
Lovely having
Thank you. Lovely. Would you mind, for our benefit of our listeners, it would be lovely if you could maybe introduce yourself a little bit and tell us a bit more about your lovely role of employee experience consultant. Sounds very intriguing.
Yes. I'm actually in an interesting crossroads. I've literally just wrapped up a 16-year corporate career where I worked at a bunch of different companies. Most recently, for the last 11 years, I've been at a large investment bank. I've taken the crazy, exciting path to actually go set up my own business. So I just recently set up my own business to help improve the experience of employees across organizations, something I'm really passionate about, been doing over the last sort of 11 years, hopefully creating better experiences for employees, because too often our experience for work can be full of friction, frustration, and hopefully creating a better place for where we spend most of our lives, right? So creating environments where people can do their best work.
Really valuable work and much needed in the world. So thank you. That's we're going to get into a lot of that, I hope, in today's episode. So thanks for joining us there. I'm excited. I think to kick us off, and in the spirit of our show, would you mind maybe just telling us a bit more about, in the context of employee experience, I suppose, what leadership means to you? Bit of a tough one.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, and I've kind of been thinking about this. And before we started today, we were having a bit of a conversation about parenting. And I think at the moment, in terms of where my journey is around leadership, I think the parenting is a key part of this leadership. I'm not sure how to articulate it, but my son turns 2 next week. So I'm in the midst of the sort of terrible 2s already. I think where this is important for leadership is, I think it's an important part around when we think about the experience of our employees. It's quite easy for us to kind of segment our experiences between home and at work. But certainly when I've become a parent, it's kind of really become obvious to me how it's hard to segregate those things. And obviously going through COVID was kind of amplified that even more so. So I think for me, leadership is really about understanding the whole person. I know it's kind of cheesy to say, and often people espouse these values, but much harder to put into practice. And I know a lot of companies are facing real difficult questions and dilemmas around things like the return to work as a particular kind of topic. But all of these come to the kind of challenge of how do you help manage and lead the whole person, knowing that they have experiences at work and they have experiences at home and everywhere in between, is a very complex challenge that I know we're kind of going to touch on a little bit today. So that's really, for me, that kind of like part of leadership is kind of remembering that we're managing humans that have incredible depth of experiences in many different ways.
As they do, right? And I think, this is an interesting one because what we're talking about today is the employee experience and especially, aspects of it tied to belonging. So I'm wondering, from a point of view of employee experience, how do you think, the organizational culture, whether it focuses on the whole person or doesn't, how do you think it influences it, especially with, companies are struggling with retention? So, is it worthwhile to really look at the whole person, or is it something that people have a problem with?
Yeah, so I think, again, COVID was really the point where employee experience became just immediately obvious that there was something that needs to be solved here with the kind of collapsing of our lives at home and at work. When you look at the kind of marketplace, and all the things employees were talking about, their experience was like really, really important. But it's interesting because these things have always been there, but it's just that COVID kind of brought these to life as being really, really important. And I think we're also still seeing that now, right, in terms of these complex challenges that organizations are facing around how should they craft the experience for their employees and create a great place to work. Now, there's lots and lots of research in this space, but there is research that shows that the companies that invest in delivering a great employee experience outperform on the S&P 500. It also shows that better employee experience can improve the profitability of the company and can reduce things like absenteeism and increase retention. So all of that together kind of demonstrates, and there's a lot of research now around this, that focusing on delivering a great experience for your employees both is the right thing to do from a kind of person perspective, but also delivers business results. And I think a lot of companies have kind of woken up to that now to say, actually, we've focused a lot on delivering products for our customers, but we need to now also think about how to deliver a great experience for our employees. And I know today we'll kind of touch on a few of those things that organizations...
Absolutely, we will. And, as someone that actually, as you said, had a long corporate career and has spent a lot of time in an organization, obviously the employee experience is quite a long overarching theme, right? And what we've talked about, like when we were initially talking about this podcast, is that you have a certain brand that you put to the employee experience, which is the perspective of belonging. Now, my question is, what is it and why is it important for the employee experience?
Yeah, so I think when you think about employee experience, it's kind of what are the different parts of it and what are we trying to achieve? Now, we obviously all work within organizations that are trying to achieve a business outcome, but obviously we're a business is made up of humans, right? And I think a big part of, again, what the research shows, a big factor that is often overlooked is this sense of belonging. And for me, belonging is about, again, going back to the thing we said at the start, individuals feeling like they can bring their whole selves to work, but they can do that in a collective sense where they feel comfortable, safe, and included within the culture of the workplace. I think a lot, in contrast to that, I think what I've noticed in a lot of companies is there tends to be a lot of focus on fitting in rather than creating the belonging. So when we think about certain processes and practices around onboarding, talent development, and everything in between, there's very much a focus on like employees fitting in. Whereas nowadays, employees don't want to just fit in. They want to feel like they belong. And that is a really hard thing for organizations to get to. Because again, we work in complex environments where there's lots of different needs between employees that cannot always be complementary.
It's really interesting, this idea of belonging. I want to go into the definition a bit more, but before we do that, maybe, Toby, I TK may recall, we had in our last season, we did an episode on employee experience. Well, we touched on it a little bit, I think. And some of the interesting things I was looking at was, you've mentioned pandemic, and there's been obviously a massive shift in not just how employee experience was affected or impacted during the pandemic, but also post-pandemic. But one of the things a lot I was looking at was around how leaders creating the right environment has a huge impact on employee experience. And we can go into things like psychological safety, etc., all of that good stuff, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything to reflect on that and how, in reality, how much of an impact is it? Or is it about this point about belonging that you're reflecting on here? I'm not quite sure, but
yeah.
I thought I'd just bring that in because there's some link maybe.
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's kind of this thing around what we're talking. We've got two phrases today which probably need some definition, which is the employee experience and the belonging side of things. when I think about employee experience, a good way to think about it, like you described, the environment is made really up of at least three things. There's the physical environment, so the real estate and the environment in which we work. That can have a massive influence on the experience of the employees. So we all know the sort of stereotypes of sort of like the startup offices with the bean bags and the high ceilings and all of that motivational posters and stuff. But the environment, again, research shows, does have an impact in terms of the experience of your employees. My perfect example for this is the car parking space. Now, depending on where you work in certain organizations, if you work in a city where people don't drive, it's not quite as big an issue. Once you get out of the major cities, car parking becomes a real issue. And it's a good example where it can really create tension if it's not addressed correctly in the workforce, because it can kind of undermine this kind of sense of belonging and equity and inclusion across the organization. If certain people get parking and certain others don't. So that's kind of like one example, I guess, from the physical environment. The other aspect I think about employee experience is the technology. Again, all of us are probably familiar with our employee technology being pretty rubbish, to be honest. I think in a lot of organizations, funding and investment isn't typically made into our employee technology. We tend to put a lot of investment and funding in the products we're delivering out to the market, which means that a lot of our internal products are not really up to scratch. There can be a lot of friction in that experience, which again creates barriers in the way of people being able to do their best work. And then the last one, which again is harder to define, but is really around the culture. It's around the interactions, the behaviors between the people that work in the company. And for me, they're the three things that kind of make up the employee experience around the sort of physical environment, the technology, and then the culture, which is really the behaviors, processes, and interactions amongst the people in the company.
I like that, where you've broken it down. And on that culture point, that's where probably that leadership element sits more closely, doesn't it? Just some of the data that I looked at, you probably know Culture Amp.
Yeah.
They do a lot of work in this area. Their research that I was looking at, and this is obviously surveying their own clients, but I mean, there's enough number there for them to produce something. Reading that engagement, there's a trend of decline over time. So ever since the pandemic kind of reached its height, 2021 onwards, where it was around 74% apparently, now around 71%. So they believe there's a global declining trend of employee engagement. So just interesting data.
Yeah, and the employee engagement thing has been a real problem for a long period of time, right? I think it's one of these challenges that a lot of people, leaders are trying to solve for, is how do you create an environment where people feel fully engaged in their work? And there's no easy answers to it, right? But as you said, Gallup have done surveys for years and years that demonstrate there's an employee engagement problem that needs to be solved for. It's just there is no easy answers at this point, I don't think.
So, and obviously, as you, and on that point, you're right. There are no easy. I mean, employees are just people. They are complex. Everyone has a huge or wide variety of needs, and I can understand and appreciate that for any organization trying to address needs, it's not straightforward. It's quite complex. So that's going to be part of the calculus for HR leaders, especially managers, when trying to improve that situation. The one other small point around how apparently even small things I was looking at, where managers don't have regular one-to-ones, can have a huge impact on things like
it does,
retention, attrition, and belonging. And when I was looking at it, I was thinking, this is ridiculous. I mean, in this day and age, 2024, still got managers not having regular one-to-ones with staff. It blew my mind, actually. I don't know. You might have come across some of this, Toby, so feel free to reflect.
I was just trying to look, because I was reading something recently around one of the other, I can't remember if it was Gallup or another research company. One of the other problems was around the manager, right? The sort of effectiveness as a manager. And there was an interesting thing there on both sides of the equation, which I think it was like something like what there was. This might be clickbait, but it might be true. Is that 1 in 4 managers are miserable at work?
Okay.
And the reverse to that was something like 1 in 4 team members feel like they've got a terrible manager. But it might be the miserable ones. But it kind of highlights this problem of like around the manager, and we put a lot of like pressure on managers to be great at their work. But it kind of shows that that some of these managers are under real stress, right? So again, it's a big part of that equation of trying to solve for these problems around the experience of employees at different levels is a very big challenge.
So I think it'd be nice to get into a bit of detail around some of the work you've been doing or have done over this very extensive career you've had in this space. Specifically on the belonging point. Have you got any stories you can tell us about work you've done to try and improve that in belonging dial? And what the impact was? I think it'd be nice if we can hear some of that. Get our listeners as well.
Yeah, so last 2 years in particular, I've been specifically focused on employee onboarding. So at the investment bank where I was working, they onboard about 100,000 people a year. So crazy scale. They have anywhere at any particular time around 350,000 employees split across the globe in various countries, doing many diverse different roles. So with that kind of platform, you can imagine it's kind of a real challenge. So how do you create a sense of belonging, given that scale, diversity, and also that churn rate of employees, right? They have a number of seasonal staff that come and go in the retail side of things. But obviously, if you just take like an average of like 10, 15% attrition rate on that side of the scale, kind of gives you a feel for like the ever-changing workforce and how you kind of create that sense of belonging. I think for me, like one of the things we've focused very heavily on is how do you create that sense of belonging for when you've got new people joining the organization. And that for me really starts before they step into the office for their first day. How do you create that sense of belonging with regards to the interview process, even if that's not someone you're necessarily going to end up recruiting? There's things you can do to create that sense of belonging from the moment of that first interaction, everything through to the first day they start work. And then also when the new hire joins, how do you help create that sense of belonging between existing team members, the manager? All of that is a really key part of that employee journey.
I can imagine, right? And it's quite exciting to think about building belonging from such an early stage. I don't know if you can spill the beans or give us some examples, maybe anonymized, when it comes to like these early stages, job advert, interview. What would you recommend to our listeners? Some experiments, maybe?
Yeah, so a really simple one that everyone can do is review the language of the artifacts they're putting out into the world throughout that process. So a very common one, which many HR professionals are probably familiar with, is the bias and language that's sometimes used in job descriptions. That can often exclude certain groups, or either consciously or subconsciously. So reviewing the language that's used. Another thing during the onboarding process, where you maybe have a candidate that's accepted an offer, is looking at how is the language that you're sharing in the artifacts that you share with the employees. A number of organizations maybe have things like background screening and other checks that occur during that process. And that can also, through research that we did, kind of create this fear of like, if I do the wrong thing, am I going to lose the job? Am I not going to be offered it? Again, things like acronyms, jargon terms, again, can create confusion during that process. So a really simple thing that folks can do is just look at the language they use through that process and just start to think, does this create a sense, is this fostering a sense of belonging for your future employee? Or is this excluding certain people inadvertently?
Yeah, it's quite a big but an easy thing to do, right? Especially nowadays, if we actually really focus on D&I, it's just a standard thing to do and something that many people don't pay enough attention to. But I'm just wondering, when it comes to onboarding, Toby, you get on, you turn up on your first day, right? We've talked about what happens before. You accept the offer, your starting day comes in, and when it comes to your first week at work. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, and I don't know that you've done extensive work and research, what are people, new employees, mostly looking at as the biggest moment of truth when it comes to their belonging in their first week?
Yeah, so it's something we just talked about previously, that is the manager is a key part. Now, what's interesting with this situation now, again, thinking back of how things have changed from COVID, is a lot of people now go through remote onboarding. So I think something like 20% of companies now do completely remote hiring, which means that when you go through that hiring process and you join for the first day, that might be actually the first day you come into the office physically. It might also be the first time that you've actually physically met the person. And that obviously is very different to before, where I think all of us have probably had much more of an in-person recruitment process. So obviously that change now introduces a number of anxieties and concerns to new hires that they didn't have before. Simple stuff like not knowing where to park their car, where certain things are in and around their office. And then also that social anxiety of meeting someone you've not met before, or maybe you've met them virtually, but meeting them for the first time in the office. Now, managers that do this well will be in the office, they'll be present and prepared to meet with their new hires. However, there are not a small amount, unfortunately, of managers that maybe aren't in the office when the new hire arrives. Maybe they're not prepared. Maybe they haven't cleared their diary. So that can create, again, from day one, if you turn up at the office, your manager's not there, they're working remotely, can create a whole bunch of problems. But these are the new things that have been, I guess, introduced into kind of our hybrid working now, that if you're hiring one or two people in a year, maybe you can manage it, right? But if you're managing larger teams, making sure that you're present when your new hire joins and the other team members and other people in your division can be quite a complex scheduling problem that, if it's not managed effectively, can definitely have an impact on the belonging for employees on the first day.
Fascinating. I guess there's a lot to be said about communication then, and perhaps that over communicating is even more important to make these new hires or potential new employees feel more at ease through that process, so that they don't start worrying and overthinking about what may happen, what may not happen, or I thought this was going to happen and I get on my first day and actually so and so's not there, and I assumed it was very important that they all sorts of things I'm sure people go through in their mind.
And it can be for smaller organizations, us talking about this, they're going to be like, this is ridiculous. It's not that complicated.
Yeah.
But when you work in larger organizations where there's maybe a matrix management structure, maybe you don't have a manager locally, right? Maybe your manager is actually based in the US and you're based in the UK.
Wow, yeah. Global.
How do you know, making sure there's someone locally that can meet them because their manager's remotely. And then we're probably getting into the weeds a little bit here, but there's obviously situations where the new hire turns up and maybe they don't have access approval, but their manager's in the US, so they're not online yet and they can't get into the building. So for larger organizations in particular, there's a number of challenges that are introduced at that kind of scale. And obviously the more technology systems that are in place, the processes, it becomes quite a complex. The way I describe it for the new hires is it's quite a complex supply chain in large companies have to come together, right?
Yeah.
Between the real estate, security, technology, HR, all of those things have got to come together in a seamless way to deliver that sort of first experience. Really.
Well, there's so much there, so much to think about and consider. I think we should go for a break. When we come back, let's see where we go with the conversation. So, see you in a few moments. Our next webinar is coming your way in October. As many of you know, L&D for many organizations is critical to employee well-being and engagement. Despite this, many organizations struggle to prioritize investment, while others consider it an afterthought. That's why we're excited to be joined by Sam Goodman, an experienced L&D specialist, who will be sharing his tips and tricks to secure the investment you need for your L&D team. He'll be walking us through his approach and explaining why it's not all about asking for a budget, but about demonstrating value to the organization. Visit our website homepage to learn more and sign up today. Welcome back, everyone. And before the break, we were discussing the details of, as Toby described it, the supply chain of the hiring process and onboarding process that many employees, maybe some of you listeners, have experienced when going through that process with the companies you've joined. I know I can recall many times where you join a company and your login details don't work on the first day, and that frustration of what do I do? Just sit around and look at everyone's faces. It might feel not a big deal for current employees, but when you're a new starter, it does make you feel a bit like unsure and a bit anxious maybe as well. So I totally understand everything you were talking about, Toby. It's unnerving. Maybe that's another good word for it. I think moving the conversation forward and thinking about change and how do we perhaps make working life better or make the employee experience better, and maybe even going back to the belonging point as well. And I know we've talked about that onboarding aspect, but we can zoom out and look at all aspects of the employee experience. From the work that you've done and the companies you worked with, are there particular areas that you'd think or you'd say this is a part of a process which is ripe for change? Why is anyone not looking at that? There's some things that can be done, organizations need to be far better at it.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind that is a real advantage to organizations when it comes to employee experience is their access to their employees. Now, contrast this to if you're doing like customer product development. Sometimes it can be quite difficult getting access to your customer. You can obviously do that through data and those kind of things, but actually getting physical access to your customers can be a quite challenging pursuit. Now, to your advantage, if you're working with your employees, you've got lots of employees on tap in your organization, hopefully easily accessible to you. So I think that's one of the areas that internal teams don't do enough of, is going through that customer discovery process, but with their actual employees. So involving them in experiments, delivery, is a really good way to start to get those insights from your employees. And I think that's something that internal technology teams and employee HR teams don't do enough of. Now, there is the route of obviously the most common way is through the annual employee survey that almost every company does. But as we know, that kind of one-stop shop, once a year kind of approach doesn't always yield the best insights. So taking that much more of an iterative approach of engaging with your customers on a regular basis. Like if I take an example at the investment bank where we worked, we had almost weekly sessions with new hires that had joined the organization to do customer research to understand what their pain points were, what their experience was like. And we physically brought them into a room, put some breakfast on, some coffee, ran some sessions. And we were always learning from those people about their experience. And there was also a side effect from that by us actually going through that process, those new hires also felt an increased sense of belonging in that we're basically bringing them together. They did a bit of networking, but it also meant that they were able to get that sense of we're looking out for them. And importantly, we're looking at how we can improve the experience for people that are coming after them. So that really created a great sense of belonging. So just that kind of process of doing that customer discovery with your employees is really important.
And it's interesting what you said about really adjusting this process and getting frequent data back. And obviously, as you said, many organizations have this annual cycle, which isn't a great feedback loop. I mean, it takes a while. We share some background when it comes to iterative product delivery, also in some circles known as agile. And I'm just wondering, from your point of view, because I'm sure you've got or had experiences when people said, well, it needs to take a while to change these kinds of common processes, right? Everyone gets onboarded. What do you say to people that say, you can only change the onboarding processes like once per year after the round of feedback? How do you help them understand that maybe doing it on a more iterative fashion is a bit better?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the first thing is just, again, understanding that the change in our expectations of employees are changing more quickly than on an annual cycle, right? We saw that obviously in COVID, but we see it now, right? Expectations for employees are changing, and they're changing as our workforce is changing, as new people are entering the workforce, and our kind of backgrounds of the people we're hiring. Maybe we're hiring more technical people now than we were. Maybe we're hiring people from different educational backgrounds or cultures. So what that means is that we need to learn more quickly around what our employees need and are looking for. And that, obviously, as we talked about at the start of the session, becoming great at an employee experience leads to a business advantage for us, as well as a better personal experience for our employees. So that ability to experiment and iterate gives us that business advantage too.
And it's a great pitch, and I agree with you. I'm sure Ira does too. But imagining that, I think more people will agree with us, which I think they will. So they will say, okay, yeah, there's a clear advantage. I know. But on the other hand, how do we make it work? Because it's not something that essentially we've been used to iterating on, right? It's great to iterate on software, maybe marketing, but these kinds of global processes, any change being made there, especially when it comes to compliance being involved in many regions and geographies, it must be incredibly hard. So how do you basically pitch the fact that it is even possible to change it on a smaller timescale in an iterative fashion?
Yeah, I guess one of the kind of steps we went through at the investment bank is we started off, one is we had a kind of compelling reason to solve for it, which was that we were having issues with our employee experience that had kind of gone all the way up to the board. So this was a kind of known problem that needed to be solved for. So there was a sense of urgency that existing status quo wasn't good enough. So that created some momentum in the organization. Then it was really a question of, there was a sense of the employee experience not being as good as we wanted it to be. So then the question was, what kind of data do we have to back that up? And again, the good thing was, in addition to although it wasn't easy, in addition to the annual surveys, there's other data points you can get around the experience of your employees to tell you that story. A really good example is just help desk tickets that are submitted. So you can very easily see, like, for example, how many help desk tickets are submitted on the first day, first 90 days, etc. So that can give you an insight into where there might be friction. Things, again, like submitting cases to HR around questions around benefits, pension, payroll. So there's an endless amount of data that can really tell that story around, is there a problem here? And then using that, I guess, using that data, you can create a good business rationale that maybe there's a problem that needs to be solved.
And it's interesting that you talk about data, right? And obviously, it helps with the sense of urgency. So, but what I'm wondering is like, imagining that as a consultant, you walk into the organization, this is something that might be helpful to our listeners too. You get your new employees for this wonderful breakfast. I'm sure the sandwiches are great. What are the first, what are the first real actionable questions you're asking, which is, what are the most important things for you to know, to understand? Where are the pain points in the onboarding experience?
Yeah, so you're asking what were the questions we asked of the new hires as sessions? Yeah, so I think we focused from a number of different angles. So one of the things we focused on is the feeling. So how does it feel to now be a new hire? What's going on in your heart as well as your head? And what we found from that is it kind of brought out all of the underlying, I guess, anxieties, fears from the new hires. We also found that, which is unsurprising to be honest, that one of the main things that people felt is they felt a sense of wanting to achieve. There was a strong achievement drive, and that might be partly due to the kind of people that the investment bank was hiring, being kind of achievers and wanting people to grow their career. But there was that sense very early on that people wanted to feel like a sense of achievement. And I think going back to Ara's point around the not being able to log in, when that happens, that kind of erodes this sense of achievement. Because in some it sounds stupid, but in some simple way, getting to your office and logging in for the first time is kind of people do a mental tick in the box, right? To say, I've done that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And when that doesn't happen, that sense of achievement goes. So that's kind of one thing we focused on, is the feeling. Also focused on, I guess, the mechanics of it, to kind of understand the process, what they did or didn't do, to kind of, I guess, understand some of the hard facts around the process. The other side of it was the social aspects of the experience. So things like, was their manager there? Do they feel like they've got a network, a mentor? So yeah, they were just a few of the things we did. What we also did is the questions we would ask. We had like a core set of things we were always like looking for. But what we also did is, depending on what experiments we were running at the time, we would also adjust the questioning angle to be geared towards a certain experiment. So like one of the experiments we ran at one time was around the information shared with employees prior to they join around location stuff. So like I said earlier, one of the differences now is a lot of employees are recruited and hired remotely, which means that they have a lot of questions around how to get into the building, where to park, and all of these practical things that maybe previously were less of a concern because if they knew the area. So we had particular questions around like how important that was to people and all that kind of stuff. So.
It's really interesting listening to that. I think what I'm thinking is, you mentioned experiments, and I think important to reflect on that just for a moment with our listeners around experiments. Don't have to be big and complex. They can be small, and testing out one particular feeling or experience, part of the experience or one part of that process, right? And I think from the examples you've been giving, Toby, you've clearly been doing that quite effectively. So amazing to hear. Thank you for sharing some of those
and I think
experiments you've been running.
And I think the other thing I would add, the other thing that worked well, which I think is common across a lot of companies, is segmenting our employee base. So with such a large organization meant that we had a very diverse workforce, and different parts of the workforce have different needs, right? The same experience for one group might be a bad experience for another. So what we did is we kind of segmented them into various groups. So like technology was one segment, retail branch employees was another one was like traders. And what we did is when we think about like experiments, we very much geared those experiments based upon the workforce that we were working with. So it meant that we weren't experimenting just randomly across many, many different groups. We were kind of focused in, say, running this experiment with our trader population because we believe at ABC. So that really helped kind of break down the problem and keep it, again, just employee centered as well.
I was going to say, and that goes back to your point earlier on about how you were able to bring those segments of your employee base into a room to talk about their experiences and help them vent and air what they didn't like, reflect on what they enjoyed, and that, I guess, is part of that bonding and belonging experience again, isn't it? So there's a bit of a virtuous loop, maybe, or affirming loop in that whole process of including them every step of the way, whether it's part of learning about what they're experiencing or involving them in change, and then reflecting on the improvements and so on. And one thing I wanted to clarify or understand, and it may be a difficult one, is how did all of this work affect retention, attrition? Is it something you're able to measure at all, or is it very difficult to do? Because I can understand there's lots of moving parts to all of that.
But, So definitely we saw a reduction in retention in terms of groups where we ran some of these experiments. So there was, in certain groups, there was and again, when we think about these big measures like retention, attrition, we tend to think of them at like a company level, but sometimes that can just kind of not give you the precision that you need.
No.
So when, again, we're running experiments, we're really saying that for this particular group, and sometimes we break it down even further to say this segment, this location, this job range, we want to see an improvement in retention, and we expect to see. So that's where we kind of break it down to make it so that, again, the measure is much easier to see the impact than the measure of that. Now, the other good thing with this being kind of employee experience and the access to internal employees is that by running experiments, you can very quickly see the effect of that. In particular, in the new hire space, where this company had lots of new hires coming in. So it meant that it was very easy to we would always had a funnel of experiments that we could run, and we were continually getting data. I think the other side to it, which we found, is that in addition to improvements in new hire experience, there was other groups that were also important in this. And a good example being going back to our manager. So we shared earlier that I can't remember what it was. 1 in 4 managers are miserable.
Yes.
One of the things we found working with managers that was making them miserable was the administrative burden associated with new hires, for example. And I did see some research from another company, and this was definitely echoed our experience as well, is that on average, there is something like 54 activities that needed to be done for each new hire. In our case, when we did the sort of time and motion study, there was about 4 hours for every new hire. So a manager had to spend around 4 hours for every new hire on administrative activities. So this is obviously like work that doesn't really add value. Also distracts the manager from the important job of preparing the people side of things for their new hire, getting to know them, introducing them, etc. So all of that stuff can actually distract the manager from the thing they want to do, and it's stuff that the manager doesn't enjoy. So we did focus, in addition to the experience of the new hire, working on other colleagues' experience to make sure that is a great experience too, right?
Fascinating, really fascinating. Thanks, Toby. I think as we draw to a close our episode today, I think there's a couple of reflections for me with our show, all about leading with agility. I think on the one hand, clearly applying this iterative experimentation thinking approach to the world of employee experience. That's one really amazing insight. But I think the other side of it for me is, and invite you to maybe share something to our listeners, or if you can, for HR leaders especially, who are in charge of and administer these experiences in processes, whether it's the onboarding process or a leaving process, whichever of these processes they are, how would you, or what would you say to them to encourage them to maybe apply some of this into how they work, and maybe switch their approach to how change happens as well? Maybe I'd welcome you to give your advice or tips to people listening.
I think I'm a big believer of this thing called Gemba, which is this Japanese term, which is probably an oversimplification, but this idea of kind of go to the place where the work happens. So go see your customer, basically. And I think in this example, I would advocate for sort of people leaders and HR to go see the experiences of their employees in action. So spend time understanding your employees, not surveying, but just actually going to see them work in action and see what that looks like. A good example on the new hire side we did was actually following new hires through their first few days to actually see what happens, see the experience. And we did that both in person and through data. And I think that creates the story. And again, this is all about employee experience. And I think the word experience is really important here, in that it's about the human experience that occurs through all of these. And you can see that through data, but you also need to go experience it for yourself. So that's the first thing I would encourage. And then off the back of those insights, start to look at some experiments. And what we also found is that when you start to engage with your employees through these experiments, the number of employees that actually put their hand up to say, do you know what, I'd like to be part of that. How can I pay it forward, or how can I get involved to change the experience for other employees in the company? And again, I think, as you said earlier, that virtuous cycle then of just the effort of trying to improve the employee experience increases that sense of belonging and inclusion and helps everyone feel like they're part of the solution. So that can create a real virtuous experience.
Nice. Thank you, Toby. I think what I'll take from that, and I hope our listeners, especially if you're a HR leader, is the idea of Gemba, right? Go to the place of work, go and see what's happening, witness it for yourself, and be far more informed than just relying on a yearly employee experience report. I think that would be the key thing for me.
I think the last thing I would just close on that, though, just a practical part of that, though, which is really challenging, is that you'll find that there's competing and conflicting needs across your employees, and like the return to work is the perfect example, right? Where one person wants to work remotely full time, another person wants to come in full time, and everyone in between.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy task. It sounds simple to say, go speak to your employees. But once your employees start speaking, you soon find that there's a lot of conflicting information and experiences. And that is really where this kind of like experimentation and product practices become really important, is to take all of that information, experiment, try things to help you make the signal from the noise. But it's certainly not an easy thing to do.
No,
at all.
It's not. No, but make a start. I think that's the important thing. Try make a start, make a dent, and run an experiment and see what you learn. That's the key thing. Thank you, Toby. There's so much more to talk about here. Maybe we get you back for another episode. Let's see what our listeners think. But I think there's much more to explore. Huge thank you.
Thank you
for joining us. It's been a real pleasure listening to your insights. I hope our listeners have taken full value from it as well, and have enjoyed it too. TK, did you want to add a closing thought?
Well, maybe just a question, a quick one, Toby, not opening a new thread, but where can people see more of you or hear more of you?
Yes.
Yeah, so I post regularly on almost every day on LinkedIn. So check me out on LinkedIn. I also write regularly on tobysinclair.com. For anyone who is an avid reader, I do weekly book summaries on there from a whole range of different leadership books and stuff like that. So a whole ton of content on there, a number of them focused around challenges around employee experience. And you can also contact me either via LinkedIn or through my website as well. And I read all my emails, and I love talking about these kind of topics. So happy to talk to anyone.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So tobysinclair.com, was that the website address?
tobysinclair.com.
In the podcast note.
Brilliant. And on LinkedIn as well. And on LinkedIn too. So there you go, listeners. That's how you can reach Toby and contact him if you want to talk more about employee experience. Thank you once again, and it's been a pleasure. And if you haven't already, to our listeners, please like or subscribe, follow the podcast for more information and to find out when our next episode drops. More exciting guests as ever on the way to you, delivered into your podcast player. From all of us, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.
Bye.